Hello and welcome to another episode of Fractional Impact. Today we're speaking to Peter Rossi about how to align legal and operational priorities so that compliance actually supports growth, the difference between contract and having a true legal strategy, and why clarity and structure helps founders scale with confidence. Peter, great to have you on. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great to be here. I'm Peter Rossi. I'm the attorney and founder of Rossi Law Office. I serve as Fractional General Counsel. I'm a formal civil litigator, and I want to continue to help companies grow across healthcare, logistics, alcohol, and consumer brands.
Awesome. And we're joined as well by Gianna Maliari from the Fractional Clients team. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Gianna.
Thanks, Stu. Yep, as Stuart said, I'm part of the Fractional Clients team, and I'm super excited to be getting into everything today with Peter.
Awesome. So my first question for you, Peter, just so that the listeners can get a stronger sense of really who you are and what you've done, tell us a bit about all of your experience and what you've been doing over the past few years.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I'm a formal civil litigator. I was actually a partner at a law firm in New Jersey right up until COVID. And what I got was an interesting opportunity to move into consulting with Solemn Consulting. And through that, where I was working consulting, started to work with some really large companies where I realized my background in litigation was actually helping drive strategy forward for compliance. I had helped start the global privacy team for Solemn. And from there, what I realized is there's a big need, not just for, for actionable advice for people that have a litigation background, but there's a big need within large, even small companies of somebody that can give practical advice and help them grow and not just be like, all right, you have to follow every little thing. So you have to do every little compliance thing because that stunts growth, but you have to sit and actually come to that X of where risk versus reward is. So based on, what I started to learn there is where I started to get into my practice where I looked to be more of a fractional general counsel. And since that, I've acquired some clients where I've been working with a startup alcohol brand here in Savannah, Georgia, where I live now, which is Zeroes Beverage, as well as a trucking company, Veteran Carriers. And I also serve in a fractional COO and general counsel role for RJ Consulting, which is actually a tissue bank based in Colorado. So I have kind of a diverse range now where I'm working with these companies that are growing in order to keep them kind of growing in that way and using my experience to help that.
Yeah, I think one of the big kind of use cases for yourself or one of the big kind of challenges you solve is helping companies not have the legal side of the business slow them down from a growth perspective. How does that look in practice? What is it that you're doing that helps companies not be held back by contracts and boring legal stuff, but actually helps them move faster?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the big things is involving me early and what they want to do. So I started to learn that as I was consulting. If you engage legal early when you have an idea, so if I was implanted with a marketing team and they have an idea, if they want to go forward with this, there's a lot of privacy laws that come into effect. If you develop the plan in a bubble and then go to legal becomes a no factory for you because they just look at the issues and they say, all right, we can't do that, and it slows down. But if you engage them in the problem solving process or as you're trying to plan, it actually becomes a driver because you're coming out with something that's actually actionable. And now we're not waiting for another solution to come in. The other thing, as I mentioned too, is just having a realistic outlook on compliance. So you have to understand, compliance is a gigantic space. And if you're complying with everything, sometimes that's going to slow down growth. And if you're not engaging legal early to talk about compliance, but also if legal doesn't understand that if you have to do every little thing in compliance and you want to do every little thing in compliance, but you cannot always do that and sustain growth. So you have to figure out where that kind of X axis comes of risk versus reward, as well as what do we actually need to comply with? Because a lot of times you'll go to legal and they're just going to read you back a statute or a rule and say, all right, this is everything we need to do. But what is actually actionable in that? And that's kind of where experience as a litigator helps as well, because you understand how this actually plays out in court or what's actually being looked at and what are the most important factors as you try to balance growth and compliance as well.
Yeah. And from your perspective, since you aren't just, you're not someone that's just spent all of their days in a law firm, where you wouldn't know what it's actually like in the day-to-day of a fast-moving company. How does your experience across different environments, maybe in-house, maybe outsourced, fractional, how does that all shape the way you work with the companies that you partner with?
I think the biggest thing is to be able to explain to them how this will ultimately play out in the long run. So when I'm looking at a contract for a client and I'm actually redlining it or looking at the other side's red lines, I'm actually able to sit there and talk to them about, all right, if this goes to worst case scenario, this is likely what's going to happen. So if we're looking, at a commercial lease situation and they're saying, they're looking at it and there's triple net leases that we have in the US and they're trying to understand what that means. And I'm explaining to them that we have to make sure that we're responsible for all the liability on the grounds. We're paying for taxes. I'm letting them know that, how this is going to play out. If someone gets hurt on your property, that you've rented, they're going to file suit against you and they'll file suit against the landlord, but the landlord's going to then turn around and expect you to cover them because of your lease obligations. And I can talk to them how that's played out in court before, because I had that litigation background with premises liability, whether it's going to be some type of declaratory judgment or tender of insurance. And that's just one example. The other example is again, like I said, understanding that there are business objectives that need to be met as well as compliance targets. And you really have to prioritize those because, again, if you're not driving the business forward, legal and compliance really becomes just a black hole, really, and I want to make sure that we're not becoming that and make sure that we're working with the client to make sure that other business goals are also compliantly being met. And that's where I try to tell them to bring me in early. Legal likes actually to be involved in the idea generation process or in the development of, like I was saying in marketing, legal actually likes to be creative and listen to what marketing's doing, and they can come to you and say, all right, well, this won't work because of this law, but let's try it this way. And the marketing team and legal team can work together to go forward. But, what happens a lot of times is everyone operates in bubbles, especially in companies. As you start to get into your roles, everyone operates in bubbles and then comes at the end to legal. And that's where legal, I joke, becomes like the no factory. We can't actually do this. We have to go back to the drawing board and it's going to take time.
Yeah, I think that's good advice to bring in legal as early as possible. But I'm sure you will have seen from your fractional work that advice isn't always taken. And, sometimes you're brought in maybe as a last resort or basically way later than you should have been brought in. When you are brought in that situation, what are the signs that you look for that the entire legal department is behind and needs fixed in some way?
So when I'm brought in that end situation, I think the first thing is to triage what's going on right now and make sure, understand how business critical this current issue is. And is it a situation where that's where you have to take that? What are the big risks here versus the rewards that are going to pay off? And is it worth going forward while we try to fix this on the back end to make it a little bit, put into a better compliance posture? Is this really important? Is this mission critical? Because a lot of times you can kind of knock those out too. We can have real conversations with the business and say, all right, is how much business value is going to be driven from this versus how much risk? And if it's a really high business value and low risk, you can really have an in-depth conversation of if it's worth going forward. And it also becomes an easier conversation when they say, all right, well, it's really a low business value. It's not going to be a huge driver for us. And there's a lot of risk. So why don't we table this while we fix it? And when you have that conversation first, it sets the table well and make sure that they understand that you're going to push priorities and understand that there are priorities, but also understand that there are things that we can't go forward with. After that, it's really just trying to fix internal communication and make sure that you're in those calls. So when I was with a large consumer brand, what we were able to do is make sure that legal just sat in. I keep going back to marketing, but that's because there's a big privacy gap in marketing where I've worked a lot in consulting. But we got legal to actually sit in the marketing meetings where they're coming up with their ideas and strategizing or talking about, all right, this is what we're going to do in our next campaign. And then legal can pipe in and say, all right, that sounds great. Let's take this offline, or these are some of the issues we're seeing. Should we schedule another meeting to talk about this? And then now legal is now ingrained in that process. And the other thing too is also educating the general counsel and in-house counsel. If I'm brought in to serve as outside counsel and help them, or even as a consultant, help them understand to engage the business more, because we as legal can get caught up in this idea of like, we're legal, they'll come to us when they need us, and we won't really reach out proactively. Excuse me. But if you are proactive, introducing yourself, making sure everyone knows who you are so they can come to you, they're much more likely to come to you with things and solve the problems before they happen. So, for example, with one of my logistic trucking companies that I've served as general counsel for, that's probably been the biggest thing, is to make sure that HR knows how to reach me, make sure that billing knows how to reach me, make sure that risk knows how to reach me, so that they can reach me and not just act on something and think that they're doing the right thing. They know that I'm available. They can send me an email. They have a way to call me, and we can address it together as it comes in, as opposed to getting down the line and then trying to fix problems later.
Leading on from that, when you're not brought in as a last resort, but rather when you're brought in to maybe a quickly growing company, what are the sort of first things that you look at and think, okay, we need to start here and we need to fix this first? What does that look like?
The first thing is understand how they're documenting requirements. Typically with fast growing companies, you have a lot of vendors, you have a lot of contracts coming in, you got a lot of things that even outside the laws that you need to be following. So understanding how are we documenting those requirements, and are we making sure they're followed? And then also, do we have some certain standards that require in our contracts for vendors? Are we making sure that they're a vendor, they have, SLAs, and that they're following everything that we need from them? But also understanding too that if we're a small growing company, we can't push back on vendors as much as we want. The other thing is just making sure that everyone understands the hierarchy and everyone's on the same page, because I think you see this a lot with fast growing companies. Everyone's going a million miles an hour, and you might have sales going one way, marketing going one way. The CEO is sitting up here, and everything's kind of funneling in three different directions. And you can run into a lot of issues that way, because no one's rowing the ship in the same direction. They're all kind of rowing in their own directions. So making sure that you kind of get everyone together and that everyone's reporting. We have, typically we have a system with the alcohol brand that I work with where I'm on most emails with legal. We have the VP and we have sales all on the same kind of executive email, so that we know what the plans are. And marketing, when we have a marketing firm, they know to reach out to us too, to run anything by us before they actually go live with anything. And they've created a system to make sure that we're checking that off. The same with, with sales and stuff, they have to know who to contact and reach out to solve certain problems, and make sure roles are defined. Is this illegal? Do we actually need to bring legal in on this? Do we actually need to bring in, the chief marketing officer, the vice president, the president, things like that.
And one of the interesting things about what you're doing and your experience is you're doing this type of work in alcoholic beverages, you mentioned, but also trucking. You mentioned healthcare, I think, at the very start of the podcast as well. Those are all totally different businesses from like a product or service perspective. How much does your job actually change in these different industries, or do you find yourself doing the same things even though the businesses are so different?
So they're very different businesses, but they're regulated businesses. When you're thinking about highly regulated industry, you just name three of the most highly regulated industries, especially in the US, globally, but in the US with alcohol, very regulated. Every state has its own law. Every state has its own licensing requirements. Every state has its own reporting requirements. When you get into healthcare, you're thinking about, you have the FDA, you have Medicare, you're starting to think about, Sunshine Act, anti-kickback, as you're, especially when we operate, it talks about it, I'm operating as general counsel and COO for a tissue bank. We're selling to doctor's offices. We're thinking about, anti-kickback, Sunshine Law, are our reps following all those rules, but also is our tissue bank following FDA requirements? Is our licensing maintaining up to date? And think about it, that's similar to alcohol, but a little different in that it's more federal. There are some state laws, but you're kind of doing the same thing, just understanding the rules of the road for each industry and then guiding based on that.
Yeah, because I could imagine healthcare and alcohol being super legislative, where from like a marketing and sales standpoint, you got to be, right within the rule book. But what makes trucking so legal in this way?
Well, if you think about trucking, you have federal motor carrier regulations, and then you're also dealing with state laws with essentially rules of the road. So every state, especially if you're doing in the U.S., is doing over the road trucking. Every state you drive through, or every state your driver goes through, it has their own regulations on top of federal motor carrier regulations for the trucking company. And probably some of the biggest issues within trucking is also the insurance, when certain insurance kicks in when there's an accident. Or even, if you're thinking about trucking or damage to a load or things like that, it all ties in a lot of different rules coming in at once. And then, like I said, if truckers, you have to make sure that your drivers are maintaining their federal motor carrier requirements, making sure that they are, stopping after so many hours, make sure that they're resting, making sure, that they're actually doing their pre-trip checks of the trucks. And telling them why all that stuff is important too. I think that comes in with the proactive as well. You try to teach them why that's important, because when everything goes wrong, you want to be able to check all the boxes that you did everything right. So, all of those industries just extremely regulated, and they have a lot of rules that deviate from federal to state, so on.
Yeah. So if you're working with a company and they have a truck going from Florida up the coast to New York or something like that, does that company have to know all of the ins and outs of the road regulation laws or whatever for all of those states that they're going through?
Well, that's why you want to have a good general counsel who can look them up. It's a general understanding of all the rules. You should know them. Is it possible to know every law across the U.S.? No, it'd be impossible. You have to be able to look it up and understand that. You have to be able to and understand with the trucking industry too. It becomes a situation where you have to be able to engage local counsel, especially the general counsel realm. So if we're a suit, I have to be able to, or you work through our insurance company or through somebody else to engage local counsel. Because there's a chance that I'm not barred there, or that would be a conflict for me to actually represent them if there's a lawsuit. But the big thing is to understand the federal requirements for trucking, making sure that your driver is licensed, make sure your driver knows what they need to do to operate the truck safely by those federal motor carrier regulations, because that's going to be a big thing. That if something happens, and I've been there in those depositions, and I think that's where it comes from. Is that I did truck accident trial work, where they're reading the plaintiff's counsel is reading back the federal motor carrier regulations to the driver, and they're saying I didn't do that. And they've been in, unfortunately, when those accidents happen, they're usually pretty tragic. You can just see the driver be like, oh no, I didn't do that. And you're just thinking in the back of your head as counsel for the company, like, oh no, this is not looking good. So that's one thing I can take to them too, is and explain why all this is important, because you want them to understand that, this is not just a formality. It's because if something goes wrong, you want to be able to say you did everything right.
Yeah. I think that's kind of something a little bit, maybe not unique, but different to most in terms of the legal industry. Because with something like, let's say, sales, if there's a sales problem, everyone's going to know about it because there's less clients or customers coming in the door. If there's a product problem, people are going to know because they're going to be getting complaints. Whereas with legal, you could have tons of risk and tons of issues with your contracts, and you never know about it until, a lawsuit comes up or something like that. And for a founder or a CEO that you might be working with, that could be, I could see that as being kind of hard to understand. And well, not hard to understand, but it makes legal look like a bit of a cost center, where you're putting money almost down the drain every month because you're not seeing any real difference. How do you communicate to founders or CEOs the value and the need for all of that?
Yeah, that's always the carrot and the stick approach. Unfortunately, a lot of times when we are talking to clients or talking to new prospects, especially when we're in the compliance space, because like you nailed it, Stuart, and you said it they're thinking of it as a cost center. This is all a cost. It's not revenue. It doesn't sound fun. It's not going to get the board excited. So that's where you kind of come in with the little bit of a stick approach, which is if if you get caught, these are what happens, or if this goes wrong, these are what happens. If you're talking about privacy, you're talking about this is the fine for every piece of information you should not have had if you're caught by a regulator. Now you have to preface that with if, so that they understand it's a risk, whether they want to continue down that road or not. If you're talking about trucking, you can start talking about, well, these are some of the lawsuits and some of the verdicts that have come out against drivers that have not done these things, or these are the fines from the regulators and when you have not done these things. And with healthcare, you can go online, you can search I can show them everyone that's been found in violation of HIPAA in the US, because they publish that list that you don't want to be on, and say, all right, there's a reputational component of it as well as possible fines, that now you're on this kind of bad actor list, or on this list of people that did not file HIPAA. And then if you obviously break some of the federal Medicare rules, you're going to jail. So you could tell them, this is outside of just losing your business. You could actually lose, you could go to jail for violating these. But you can also sell the carrot approach, which is how, that's where we talk about getting legal involved earlier, so that you can compliantly drive forward, and you're kind of reducing your risk then, and you continue with your business initiatives. And that's where you start showing, the advantage of that. You have to talk about, they probably have to have some hiccups in the past that show where it slowed up at legal, to then show them the advantage of operating in a way where legal is working with everybody to push forward, so that they can see how much more quickly and how much more compliantly they were able to actually take those ideas, action them, and grow their business.
Yeah, interesting. Gianna, I think you were going to ask something.
Yeah, slightly different from that question, but have you ever been approached by maybe a founder or a business owner thinking, well, they think that they're coming to you with a legal issue, but it turns out that it's not a legal issue? I think what I'm trying to ask is, are there common misconceptions where people think that there are legal issues, but in fact, they're not?
Oh, I mean, yeah, absolutely. You'll have questions that come in, about, it becomes about payroll, where it's not a legal issue, where they think it is because there's a contract, but it's actually an issue with payroll being processed, or things like that. But I think that's where it's important from legal, and I should have said this in the beginning, to understand all the operations of the business too, because you want that trust where they come to you, and then you can either answer their question or get the right person to answer the question as well for that person. So you're talking about a founder, they're looking, they're sitting above and looking at everything from 1,000 feet, and they're not just responsible for marketing or HR or sales, they're responsible for everything. So if they come to you, I think the best thing you could do is not say, well, that's not a legal problem. You can say, well, actually, this is this department. Let me introduce you, because I've actually already met them, or let's bring them in on this. And then you can ask that question. And that shows too the collaboration as well within the company, that you can drive as legal.
Yeah. And one of your, I guess, claims to fame is you've handled very complex data privacy and compliance programs for really big companies like Calvin Klein, for example. How do you bring the sort of resource and the rigor that you would have in those large companies into smaller, more fast-moving companies?
I mean, yeah, there's definitely a difference in the size when you're talking about a company that size, and thinking about, because it's not just Calvin Klein, you're talking about PVH Corp, which is a lot of their different organizations. They have a different amount of resources that can be allocated, and you have to explain that to a smaller company. But you can say that they've done it this way, but they had different resources. They can home grow a lot of things that a smaller company cannot. But through working with all different size companies, when you work with a large company, it's kind of nice because they can home grow a lot of things, and you can work on more complex solutions, and they can kind of customize a lot of tools and things like that because they have the resources. But what I've learned is, and what's been great about working with all different companies, different sizes, you can explain that to a smaller company. All right, if you wanted to, work, this is a very large pharmaceutical company. They have a lot of different resources they can do. This is what they did. Now we can accomplish similar to what they did to make sure that they solve their problem. So, for example, if it's a privacy problem, they might have homegrown their cookie banners, and they're able to have someone that's able to monitor their cookie banners, make sure that everything's working. I can then go to a smaller company and be like, and say, this is what they do. They have a lot of resources. They can custom manage all of their different things. But what happens is when you go to a smaller company, you can then say, well, I also have these other solutions for that are software. This is the price, but it scales down some of the manual work they need to do because you don't have the resources. It accomplishes the same thing that they're doing here, but it simplifies it for that. So, I work with a lot of different and met a lot of different softwares that can fill that gap in for smaller companies, or just simplifying their processes kind of to make it as, as easy as possible. So if I'm thinking about a small company that needs to comply with a lot of privacy laws, I'm probably telling them you don't want to take a kind of bifurcated approach where you're just making sure if somebody's from California, for the US, because we have all our different privacy laws as well. If somebody's from California, they get a different set of privacy rules that can automatically be generated in your company, as opposed to somebody from Montana or something like that. I'm probably telling that smaller company to simplify it, find the strictest rules, and I can lay them out for them and follow them all, because then it just streamlines the whole process. You should never really run afoul of everything. Whereas for a larger company, you can talk to them about that bifurcated approach of, all right, you want to apply it state by state for each individual that visits your website, and you have the resources to be able to do that. So we can take that approach as well.
And if someone went onto your LinkedIn right now and looked at your experience, they would probably see a lot more operations leadership work than they might expect. How do you find your experience in operations leadership helps you with that, fractional general counsel side of things? And does it allow you to, I guess, add or provide extra value that maybe another fractional GC couldn't?
I mean, yeah, because I have different goals that when I sit in an operations hat. Your goals are the business, so you're trying to make sure that everything's moving forward. Making sure that the sale, is going forward, the contract is signed, that we can sell to the client X. And you have to. That's where actually I was sitting on the other foot. And I was working with legal to get that done. And it allows you to put on different hats. It also allowed me to have different conversations with legal where I could actually explain to them, I understand your concern about this, but this is the way I see it, and have frank conversations with legal about that. And I think that's the big thing that I can do on the other end with the business as well, is like, because I've worn both hats, I can legitimately tell them I've worn both hats. I understand what we need to do. And that also is why I developed the kind of the risk versus reward approach, where I sit and ask that most important question when they come to me from legal is, well, what are we actually trying to drive, and how much growth or how much benefit will that give to the business? Because that'll change how much risk we're willing to take on in order to do it. And I think that's probably the most important question that can be asked right away from legal. I don't think it's asked enough.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I 100%. So if I was a founder or a CEO of a trucking or a healthcare or any kind of company that compliance is a big thing, and I am working with a law firm already, what is kind of the use case or the reasoning for me to go and speak to you and maybe work with you, as opposed to just sticking with my current firm?
Well, I think it really depends on it also depends on how you're engaging that law firm. If you're engaging that law firm just with problems that come up, which happens a lot. The legal industry is very reactive. Typically, you're engaging a law firm after something bad has happened. There's a lawsuit filed, there's been a breach of a contract, and something bad has happened, and that's why you've reached out. And it's a very reactive industry, where I would say the advantage of reaching out to someone who can act as your general counsel, in a fractional role. Because we understand too that as a growing business, it's a big expense to bring in somebody full time to be your general counsel. But if you can size it where you have somebody that you can go to proactively, it's gonna lower your expenses as you reach out reactively when there's issues that happen. And it gives you kind of that peace of mind, and gives you the ability to ask those questions that you might not have the answers to, or you might just try to research it on your own and try to answer it. But now you have the backup of, you actually have a counsel you can reach out to. And I think it's the biggest advantage, is you can be more proactive than reactive. Because if you just have a law firm on retainer, depending on that scope of that retainer too, you might be hesitant to reach out because every time you reach out to them, it costs X, Y, and Z, depending on that. And, you want to make sure you're only coming to them with real problems. If we think about a fractional approach where we can come to a right size of how many, my typical approach is how many hours do you want of my time a month to come ask me questions or to proactively work together to solve these problems. It would reduce, I think, some of your costs as well to go to just an outside law firm right away.
Yeah, must do. And what kind of either revenue range or funding range does it typically make sense to start working with someone like yourself? Because I would assume, there must be a point where a company is too small, where the financial outlay might not make sense for them. And there maybe comes a time where hiring someone full-time is the best option. What kind of revenue / size range is the fit for you then?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we talk about revenue size, but I think it also comes into risk as well. That industry that you're in is also going to determine how much revenue you need in order to bring somebody in. Because if you think about you're in a high risk industry, the threshold for when you need to bring, when I say high risk, it's a very compliance driven industry. If you're thinking about healthcare or liquor, your threshold of when you need to engage counsel is probably a lot lower than somebody that might just be selling, t-shirts on an Etsy store or something, not to say that that's not different, but, really when you be thinking about healthcare, alcohol, bringing somebody in from a compliance standpoint, it's probably right from the beginning, because that's going to be a big driver. You need your licensing. You need to make sure that, you're complying with federal and state laws. That probably needs to be in your kind of budgeting considerations right away. Whereas if you're, like I said, you're a consumer brand, things you probably, as you get into that kind of starting to see, you're getting into like $1 million, $2 million kind of revenue range, but you're seeing now, I have a vendor contract now. I've hired somebody that, is printing my goods for me now. I have insurance contracts now. Am I complying with them? I have employees. If you're just kind of a solo, that's when you got to start realizing, as they scale and as you start having more vendors and it becomes more complicated and you're kind of getting into that revenue range of like that $1 million, $2 million range, having someone that you can call and ask a question to is really important. And then, like I said, the high risk industries, like that's something you should be thinking about having someone, right away as you're kind of trying to scale that business, because, if you do it wrong, it's a lot of wasted money that could cost you a license in the end. Could cost you a license and ability to operate in the end of it, before you even start.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure a situation you'll have seen before with these high risk or very compliance oriented companies, whether it's alcohol, trucking, healthcare, etc. You'll have seen them probably move into new territories or new states to support their growth. Are there any mistakes that you see in that phase coming up over and over again that you would warn founders or chief execs to try to avoid?
One biggest thing is moving. I think the biggest thing is just trying to expand without understanding, this is probably the biggest thing I've seen as legal. I can get you a license in that state or the ability to operate in that state, but do you actually have the business need to operate in that state? And then it just becomes do you actually have the business to operate yet? So it's not working together with legal and business before you kind of pick a new territory, a new designation. It just sounds good. Because if, let's say I register you with that state or we get your appropriate licensing to operate in that state, but you have no business to do in that state. Now it's just a cost center because we have to maintain that license. It's if we let it go, it's going to take another 6 months to get, because we have to reapply. So really considering that and then timing it right to make sure that, all right, legal and business are working together so that we can move into that state without issue, or that territory without issue, or we're not sitting on a license for 6 months while we drum up the business to do that. Now, some of that's chicken or the egg, because sometimes you need to be able to do business in that state to solicit new business, but that's a real conversation we should have before we start considering that. And it's one where you have to include both business and legal. You can't just include business because then you won't actually be legally to operate. You can't include legal because then you won't have the business to justify the expense that we just went into, to get there.
Right. So you see sometimes that either they maybe get licensing, etc., too early, and then they're just pouring money down the drain, or they maybe try to get involved too late at the point that they really should have had it a few months ago, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it can affect relationships when you're trying to move into a new territory and you're saying, all right, we're ready to go, but you did not tell legal. And now, legal's like, wait, we actually need 4 months because we don't have a license or we're not registered with the state to do business there, and on the unfortunate part, a lot of that, like moving and expanding, it's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of work within state agencies and stuff that needs to be done that you have no control over anymore as legal. Like, you just submit things and you have to follow up and wait. So there's a time to that. So you need to make sure that you're timing both the business and the compliance parts of it together. And that's where, I think the biggest takeaway I can say is just make sure everybody, business and legal, kind of stay lockstep together.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best way for business and legal to stay in that lockstep?
Like I said, the biggest thing I think is just making sure everybody knows who to go to, but also making sure that you develop that trust. I think from a legal perspective, we can have a reputation of, if you become that person that says no all the time and don't try to understand what the business is doing, you're going to lose that trust in the business, and they're not going to come to you. If I say no to sales, if I'm working for a company and I say no to sales all the time, their job is to sell. They're going to stop coming to me on things and just try to work around me to get it done. And that's not going to be best for business. It's not going to be best for the company. But if I can actually sit with them and talk with them about the problems and show them that I can actually accelerate the deals, or that I'm not trying to kill everything, I'm trying to actually make sure that we're doing it the right way. That's where, you have that trust, and that involves work by legal, reaching out, like I said, making sure that they get to know you, making sure that they understand what your goals are, and not just saying no, or not just saying, well, that doesn't comply with the law. Like, really explaining to them everything and earning that trust is what's really important.
This question is a bit kind of random or off topic, but as you might imagine, with a lot of the people we work with, their work now as a fractional exec since sort of the pandemic, etc., has gone, either fully online or 80-90% online. With what you're doing with these industries in healthcare, trucking, they're a bit more real in many ways. How much of your work with these companies is actually online versus in the office or at the site?
Yeah, so it depends. The two of the companies I work with I live in Savannah, Georgia, so they're in Savannah. So I can go to the office, the liquor and trucking. I can go to their office at any point that I need to. Obviously, I work remotely most of the time, but if I need to, I can go into the office, and ask them questions. I have a place to sit there because, it is Savannah. It's not a private office or anything, but I could go in and work with them. Now my work within the tissue bank, it is in Colorado. I typically fly out there monthly to just make sure that we have a person that has to manage the tissue bank, make sure that they're actually doing, this is the business, the operations part of it. We have SOPs, make sure they're cleaning, making sure that they're doing everything that we lay out that they have to do to make sure that tissue bank's complying with all the regulations. And it really depends on the need of the client, how much they actually need me on site, where some of my bigger clients I've been strictly remote for. We can, Zoom into meetings. I can, meet with people via Zoom. And that cuts down on cost as well, too, because I think there is, especially for a growing company, there's not necessarily always a need for me to be on site. We can do a lot of things online that need to get done. They can ask me questions and meet along those lines. But, it really depends on the need of the company, how much, I can be there, and I can make sure I'm there in person. I think most people can make sure that they're in person when they're needed.
Yeah. And this is maybe a language difference between the UK and the US. What is a tissue bank? You've referenced that a few times. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, so we're actually a distributor of amniotic tissue, so treat wound care. And we have an FDA tissue bank license in order to store the amniotic tissue.
So like if you get a cut, you would wipe that type of tissue on the cut. Is that right?
No, it's more so for you think about ulcers and surgical wounds and things like that. So a lot
Right.
it's actually, so I went to our manufacturer to see it, see one of those. It's actually placenta. It's made from the placenta. And it's amniotic tissue, so you have some stem cells in it, and it's laid on the wound to actually treat. So,
Wow. How does because that sounds quite B2B related.
yeah.
Same of course with trucking, but alcohol, is largely either B2C or B2B2C. How does your work change whether you're working in a purely B2B versus B2C business? Are you having to work with different regulators or different laws, or what are the differences between those two types of companies?
Yeah, so alcohol is actually a really interesting industry because I think you said it best, it's B2B and B2C. And the US has our 3-tier laws where we can only operate as a manufacturer. We can only sell to wholesalers, really, and wholesalers can sell to restaurants, bars, and liquor stores who then can sell to the customer. But as a brand, as a manufacturer, also a brand, we need to make sure that the consumers also know about the brand. So when you're operating in that realm, I'm operating with B2B, which is very similar to trucking and to the tissue bank, where we're focused on marketing. A lot of marketing is focused on LinkedIn or just on professional networks because you're selling to other businesses. When you get into something like alcohol, or even when you're talking about consumer goods, now you kind of get into the realm too of I have to make sure that we're complying with advertising requirements, especially in the alcohol industry. Because we need to drive brand awareness. So we operate in a space where we can't sell direct to consumers, but we have to drive awareness to the consumers so that they go to their retail establishments and buy the drink. So we are making our own commercials, or making sure that we have our own social media presence. And that's where now, outside of just making sure that our contracts look good, I'm making sure our advertising is compliant. Where we're not, if it's alcohol, not advertising to minors, not showing anything over consumption, making sure that that we're complying with the 3-tier laws as well, so we're not selling directly to consumers, making sure that all our reporting to states follows up with that, so that shows that we're not selling directly to consumers, because we don't run afoul of that system and then risk losing our license as well there. So it really just stands differently of where what you end up dealing with, and probably when you're talking about B2C as well, then you also get into different insurances and we have to understand our manufacturing process and make sure that we have the right, when I'm thinking about alcohol specifically, when it's being made, making sure, wine is regulated by the FDA under a certain amount. And then we have the federal tobacco TTB bureau for the liquor, and it all runs different based on that as well.
Yeah. The alcohol thing is really weird when you put it that way, how you're marketing to a different audience than you're actually selling to, which is such a weird thing. And you were saying that there's laws basically where you have to only sell to that next stage. So the manufacturer sells to the warehousing, to the retailer, to the consumer. So if you're the manufacturer, can you not sell directly to the consumer?
So there are some carve outs where you can, but typically in the US, since I'm sure someone that's been in alcohol industry more might say something different, but since Prohibition, really, if you think about the US, and it had an interesting time of Prohibition, we have a very still strict laws around alcohol that exist, and even in the Southeast where I live. And what has come out of that is a 3-tier system in the US, where you have to operate along that 3-tier system, where you sell, a manufacturer sells to a wholesaler sells to a bar, restaurant, liquor store, that ultimate retailer, and then the consumer can buy from that retailer. There are small instances where direct purchasing can happen, but it's not the norm, and it's not something you would build your whole business on.
Yeah. It's interesting now what you're saying. Some of the laws and the whole system comes from the Prohibition, which was, like, for me, I think of that as something so long ago. I don't know much about it, although I have watched was it The Untouchables? Is that the movie? It was, yeah. So I've seen that. Cool. So for anyone listening, what is the best way for them to find out more about you and get in touch?
Yeah, so definitely on my LinkedIn, which I'm sure we'll have linked here. You can reach me on my email, prossi@rossi-lawoffice.com. My website should be going live here in the next few days, hopefully. I'll make sure that that's linked in my LinkedIn as well. But right now, best way is to reach me on LinkedIn or at my email right here.
Awesome. Cool. Gianna, any closing comments or questions before we finish?
Nothing from me. Thank you, Peter.
Awesome. And for the viewers and listeners, thanks so much for joining. Peter, thanks for chatting with us today, and we'll see you all in the next one.
Thank you.